today, just look backwards and you can see where they got their inspiration. That's a really interesting book. The book today, though, is fascinating in itself. Mr. Strandmark is a native of Madison, Indiana, a graduate of Hanover. He has 2 master's degrees, one in history and one in library science from IU. He's working now at UK as an archivist with the Oral History Project. Is that the idea? Mm-hmm. And I didn't realize that this book is part of a series of oral history matters on Kentucky. For example, Governor Patton has a book out now. There's a book on Barry Bingham. There's a book on Earl Combs. And I just happened to read a book recently from that very series called Freedom on the Border. It was a history of civil rights, an oral history of civil rights in Louisville by Tracy K. Meyer and Catherine Fossil, both of whom teach history at the University of Louisville. So this is quite a series of books to look into. This book is about Gatewood Galbraith, and I've had the great honor to read the book. What caught my eye was the subtitle, The Uncommon Man, and there's a chapter in there entitled The Last Free Man, and we're about to find out what the author meant by that. So, yeah. Mr. Strandmark.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for having me. I really appreciate you taking the time to come. And I promise I'm not going to talk at you for too long because I'd love to save some time to answer any questions that you all might have. The one good thing about this is, and I appreciate the introduction, so thank you so much for that. I am the education archivist at the Special Collections Research Center at the University of Kentucky. And I joke that a lot of the reason that they hired me was that I could project my voice for these like 50 to 100 person undergraduate classes that I do teach. So hopefully you all can hear me all right. But I'm really glad to be here. This has been so much fun to the most fun part of this process has been talking about the book after it's been published, more so than writing it. If any of you have had experience doing these long projects, that probably sounds very familiar with you. So it's a real honor to be able to go around and to share some of this work that's been done. And again, with that introduction, I grew up just about an hour away in southern Indiana. I promise I did not come here to brag about UK basketball from Lexington. I am a lifelong IU basketball fan, so I'm here to commiserate with all of you. I promise. I just try not to share that too often in Lexington. So again, I'm just so glad to be here, and it's a real honor, especially because so much of this book, the work that Gatewood did, as we will talk about and we'll dive into, has mirrored a lot of the great services, a lot of the free clinics, a lot of the expungement work that you all make available here in Jefferson County, which is just absolutely needed, not only here, but in pretty much every community throughout Kentucky. So I'm sure that, the same mission that you all are dedicated to would have been really near and dear to Gatewood's heart as well. So just kind of start at the beginning. Again, you can tell I teach a lot. I'm going to try not to use my hands too much, but just kind of how I first learned about Gatewood. So I grew up in southern Indiana. You would have think that if I had paid a little bit more attention to politics, I would have heard about Gatewood. If any of you are familiar, Madison, we get all of the Louisville stations, right? So a lot of times we got more information about what was going on in Louisville and Kentucky than we did what was going on in Indianapolis. But I wasn't very familiar with Gatewood other than maybe just recognizing his name. So of course, I graduated from Hanover College in 2012, and Gatewood passed away in early January of 2012 as well. But what I did learn about him was through the papers that we have, the personal papers, his collection that we collected with the help of his family that we hold at the University of Kentucky. So we have a collection not only of his correspondence, of all of his campaign materials, but also memorabilia. A lot of people who knew Gatewood or recognize him probably think of like him showing up constantly in this wide brim fedora that he was very famous to wear, or a hemp seersucker suit that he would wear to a lot of these different campaign events. And we have all those materials freely and publicly available at the University of Kentucky at Special Collections as well. So when we did process those papers and when those opened up to the public, the idea was to create an exhibit that could be on display at our library as well as the Lexington Public Library. So I was the person who curated that exhibit, choosing out photographs, again, these like physical objects, campaign buttons, campaign materials, posters that we were able to have at UK and elsewhere throughout Lexington. So that was really my first introduction to Gatewood. I was immediately interested and immediately invested. I think we can see now, and we'll talk more about this, the kind of Gatewood's legacy in Kentucky, and not only Kentucky, actually across the country, that he, I talked to so many people for this book, and we'll talk about this oral history project, but what came up over and over and over again was that Gatewood was ahead of his time. Almost every single person I spoke to said that exact phrase. And I think we've seen, even in the past, decade since Gatewood passed away, how kind of prescriptive and how he was a prophet for a lot of these laws that have been passed recently, especially related to medical and recreational marijuana. So we will talk more about that, but basically this arose really during the COVID pandemic, which is hard to believe now that this was 4 years ago when COVID, I know we probably all remember where we were 4 years ago when COVID started. I had a 2-year-old at home. Our second child was coming in June of 2020, right? So we not only had to pivot and figure out how to do all this work from home and serve University of Kentucky students and faculty members, but I also had at least a little bit more free time where I could think about how I could reach out and how I could kind of build on some of the scholarship, and Gatewood immediately came to mind. So what happened with this, because of my association at UK, I am the education archivist. My daily responsibilities are focused on making sure that students can access, use, and understand archival materials, primary source research, and to do that kind of work. But I also work with the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History. So again, in the introduction, you kind of mentioned the tradition of oral history that we have in Kentucky, which is extremely strong, not only here at U of L, at the Kentucky Historical Society, the Kentucky Oral History Commission has done outstanding work for decades now, and then at UK, the Nunn Center for Oral History, so named after Governor Louis B. Nunn. We now hold over 18,000 oral history interviews, many of which are digitized and completely and freely available to anyone who wants to access and use those as well. So because of my association with the Nunn Center, I was able to basically say, hey, we did a few oral history interviews with Gatewood's really close family when we got his papers, when we did this collection. Can I kind of expand this a little bit? And luckily, and to the credit of Doug Boyd and other people at UK, they said go for it, right? So basically, armed with only a .edu email address, which is strangely powerful when you're trying to get in touch with people, I was able to do about 35 to 40 more interviews. And the people that I did interview and talk to about Gatewood were not only all of his living siblings, his family members, his friends, attorneys that he practiced with in Lexington and throughout Kentucky, but also people that he oftentimes ran against in these political races, right? So I was able to interview former governors and senators and congressmen and a lot of people that I will mention really briefly when we dig into this a little bit more. So for those of you who maybe are not as familiar with Gatewood, which is totally fine, if you aren't as familiar, Louis Gatewood Galbraith, who was known for that middle name Gatewood pretty much throughout his entire life, was actually born in Nicholas County, Kentucky, did not move to Lexington until he was about 12 years old, and especially growing up in Carlisle and Nicholas County, they lived and existed in this very small rural community, this very small bubble that a lot of both Gatewood and his siblings kind of described as like the fictional like Mayberry, right? Everyone in the community knew everyone else. It was very safe. His father actually ran and operated basically a car dealership and an auto mechanic service, and it was a majority Catholic community as well, which is fairly rare for that area of Kentucky. So Gatewood was one of 7. Gatewood's father was running a business, and basically Gatewood's mother, who was college educated, who had gone to Peabody Teachers College, which later became associated with Vanderbilt in the 1930s, before this was very much widely done, basically stayed home and took care of and raising these 7 children. So Gatewood, as he was growing up, especially was known for having a lot of various sicknesses. So a lot of people didn't know this about Gatewood, but he especially suffered from asthma. So he had this very acute form of asthma where sometimes his throat would just completely close up. And you can imagine growing up in the 1950s when this was happening, there was not a lot that especially doctors in small rural communities could do to help him. He also, through kind of being wild in his own way, had a lot of different injuries growing up. He ruptured his spleen at one point, had to spend a month in a hospital in Lexington. He did have a lot of these injuries where he basically had to stay home and rest, and this really turned Gatewood into a curious intellectual. He was known as a voracious reader, and it really grew his imagination in ways that might not have been possible if he didn't have this kind of time to reflect as a child growing up. But it really gave him this kind of keener zest for life, and it led him to dreaming really big, which we will see and which we'll talk about later. And so I'm not going to read too much from the book, but there are a few quotes I did want to share. And this was someone that I interviewed. So some of you are familiar with Farrell Wellman. Farrell Wellman did a lot of interviews for KET and worked in local news here in Louisville as well. And Farrell said this about Gatewood. This was when Gatewood had moved to Lexington and he enrolled in a local high school. He was his presence, and there was something about Gatewood. He had a chip on his shoulder all through high school. I mean, he was the guy walking down the hall looking for a fight, and he got into them. He got into trouble constantly because there was no mute on Gatewood. If someone looked at him cross-eyed, he would not only say, "What are you looking at?" He would then provide an evaluation of what he thought of that particular person and their lifestyle. So Gatewood was, him and all of his siblings, quite honestly, never shied away from a fight. Gatewood, and this was not to say that any of them were bullies, because most of the fights were results of those people bullying other people or bullying other people in his family. So they grew up having a keen sense of looking out for one another, having this very tight-knit, big family. And they were not afraid to protect one another when it really came down to it. So Gatewood, especially when he moved to Lexington, you can imagine, and maybe some of you have experienced this, moving from a very small rural community into what he probably saw as a big city, to Lexington, enrolling in this massive high school as he saw it again, Lafayette High School in Lexington. There's a lot of people who are obviously going to give him a hard time, coming from Carlisle. So in his autobiography, Gatewood remembers transferring to Lafayette and starting fights with all the bullies he could find. And this is a quote from Gatewood. "I know I got into 10 fights the first week and developed such an immediate reputation by whipping the 4 biggest bullies there one at a time, that soon after, if someone had something to say about my strangeness, they did it out of my earshot." So Gatewood not only was known to be this kind of like troublemaker, he was rambunctious from the time that he could walk, basically. So there's story after story of him pulling pranks and doing these different things growing up in Carlisle. But especially what stuck with me is that when his parents were reflecting on what it was like growing up with him, oftentimes, having 7 children, they would get one babysitter for 6 of the kids and an extra babysitter just for Gatewood. So that tells you about all you need to know about who Gatewood was and what he was about. So again, Gatewood ended up graduating from Lafayette in Lexington. He had actually started at Lexington Catholic High School and had actually gotten kicked out of that school, and finished at Lafayette, and then enrolled immediately at UK. This was a big reason that Gatewood and his family, actually really his mother Dolly, chose to move the family from Carlisle to Lexington. She had grown up in Carlisle. Her parents were business owners there. Again, part of this very tight-knit community, but she basically chose access to education for her 7 kids, right? So because of that, they lived literally just down the road, just down Limestone Street off Dantzler Court in Lexington, so that they could literally cross the street and be that close to this kind of culture and this intellectual curiosity. And she was a real champion, not only for Gatewood, but for their entire family. And there's often times where they interviewed Gatewood's father, who was this reserved, very masculine guy, and it was basically like whatever your mother says goes, right? So when she made up her mind that they were moving, they moved. And so Gatewood actually didn't immediately enroll. He actually joined the United States Marine Corps, and went through and started to do training at Parris Island in South Carolina. Had various very acute asthma attacks when he was going through basic training, and was actually honorably discharged due to medical reasons, right? So he had this period of years where he bounced back and forth. He would enroll at UK and he would fall behind in classes and drop out, and re-enroll and drop out for about 5 or 6 years. So by the time Gatewood got really serious about school in about 1969, 1970, he was basically a 25 or 26-year-old freshman, once he had kind of followed his way along. So Again, back in Lexington, became really involved. This is a very strange shift, right? He goes from basically joining the United States Marine Corps just as the war in Vietnam is kind of kicking into gear in 1966, to eventually enrolling at UK and becoming deeply involved in this like very countercultural hippie movement that was going on campus. Some of you might be familiar with this. This was especially big at UK, especially following the Kent State shootings in May of 1970. Obviously, there were protests all across the country at different college campuses. That was especially true at UK. So students, there's still some disagreement about how this happened, but there was the ROTC building on campus was basically firebombed during one of these protests, was burnt down. They occupied the Patterson office tower during a Board of Trustees meeting. Former Governor Happy Chandler, who was then the chair of the Board of Trustees, actually punched a student in the face as they were trying to exit the building. And they actually ended up closing campus down and sending all the students home that year in May of 1970 because there was this unrest. National Guard troops on campus. We have video not only of these marches that went on, of the fire that happened, but also National Guard troops firing tear gas at student protesters as well. So Gatewood loved that. I mean, just being the center of attention and being in the middle of kind of this conflict and feeling so alive with it, Gatewood was definitely saw himself as a leader of this movement on campus, even if maybe some of the more administrative or organized sections of students maybe didn't see Gatewood in that way. But if there was a speaking engagement, you can guarantee that Gatewood was going to be there and taking part. In the midst of all this, right? So he goes through, he graduates from UK. He actually enters and enrolls at UK Law School in the middle 1970s. In about 1975, 1976, he publishes something that he continues to reflect on and call throughout his career, the Model Plan for Legal Marijuana. So Gatewood did not grow up as a marijuana user. He really didn't discover it until he was back and living in Lexington and going to school at UK following his brief stint in the Marine Corps. Had honestly grown up and had grown into somewhat abusing alcohol actually. And once he found marijuana, once he started experimenting with marijuana, he was completely sold right away. He credits that with a lot, not only with treating his asthma that he suffered with throughout a lot of his childhood and his teenage years, but also which allowed him to actually buckle down and finish his studies at UK. So it's kind of interesting to hear that. But again, from the book, so Gatewood, in this model plan that he wrote, basically as an L1, as a law student, basically putting together this pretty far out there plan, right? But he's trying to illustrate and he's trying to get out these points about what he believed about the potential for marijuana. So Gatewood reiterated the value of this plan, that this cash crop perfectly suited the Kentucky climate and soil and could conceivably enrich nearly every farmer in the Commonwealth who was just trying to scrape by. He broke down the mechanics of his model plan, discussing an allotment, closed market, and tax system that would make the state government responsible for regulating the sale of marijuana while raising revenue for the state as well as for the farmers who participated. So this is so important in understanding kind of his future campaign platforms as we saw him run in election after election after election, because it honestly does not change that much from this plan that he put together in the mid-1970s. It's also really interesting, if any of you have paid attention to, obviously recent events that have happened here in Kentucky, finally, about the passage of medical marijuana that's going to become available January 1st of next year. If you look, if you dig into the plans that they're working on, it's following a lot of these exact same things that he's writing about and that he described. And we'll come back to that as well. So he finally passed the bar after taking it 3 times, and he began to practice in Lexington and started running for political office in 1983. A lot of Gatewood's passion really goes back to his upbringing in Carlisle. So growing up in a rural community, basically a community full of farmers, he had this very, very deep connection with the farming community throughout the state, right? So had identified with them, thought about them constantly, and thought it was horrible how much they were being taken advantage of. So we mentioned this subtitle of the book when we came in. A lot of you may be familiar with Gatewood's book, his autobiography that he wrote, which is basically called The Last Free Man in America, and about what he calls the synthetic subversion, right? So this is something that Gatewood preached about and talked about on the campaign trail constantly, was basically pushing back against these massive corporations that he saw as taking advantage of these smaller communities throughout Kentucky in a lot of different ways. One of those ways was taking kind of the power away from Kentucky farmers and transferring it to these massive conglomerates that we saw growing, especially throughout the 1980s and 1990s. And we'll also talk about how he saw this related to the pharmaceutical industry as well. So the first time he runs for office is for agriculture commissioner in 1983. As a relative unknown, he very much performs as an unknown. So he finishes fourth in the Democratic primary in 1983, but it really is the first time that people start to recognize him across the state, not only for these kind of outlandish ideas about, espousing the potential for recreational marijuana and access, as well as how it could help Kentucky farmers, but also just for his speaking style. So a lot of you, again, if you're familiar with Gatewood, if you met Gatewood, if you saw any coverage of Gatewood, this was what kind of jumped off the page at anybody who ever saw him or met him, right? Gatewood could turn a phrase like no one else. He was always described, even by his siblings growing up, as a stand-up comedian, never afraid to speak in front of a crowd, and extremely sharp in coming up with these like quips and one-liners, which not only the news stations loved, but political reporters loved in Kentucky, right? So he got even a lot more coverage for a lot of his campaigns than others would have for the chance that he had to win, especially thinking about kind of openly espousing these views starting in the early 1980s, because he was so energetic and charismatic and could kind of draw a crowd in like that as well. So most people became more familiar with Gatewood the first time he ran for governor, and this was in 1991. So running the Democratic primary for governor. And again, a lot of people are really familiar with Gatewood because of his lifelong friendship with Willie Nelson, the country music singer. There's an interesting story with this, and basically Gatewood throughout his entire life, which really hurt his ability to run in a lot of these races, was awful with money. There's no other way to put this. He was just awful with money. A lot of people that I interviewed or talked to about was just like, it just did not compute, it did not settle with Gatewood, that he had to manage his money or think about it in this way. In a lot of ways as well, this hurt his ability to run for office, because not only could he not really manage money very well, but also he was not willing to negotiate on his views, especially related to recreational and medicinal marijuana, which made it extremely difficult to do any kind of fundraising when this was so far out of the norm, when no one would believe that anybody could be elected kind of on this platform, right? So these kind of cascading things made it really difficult for him to do this. So basically in 1991, his campaign's sputtering. He's driving all across the country, all across the state, to show up at these different political events and these campaign rallies and things like that. He has about $600 left to his name. He pays for some studio time in Lexington, basically sits down for a 30-minute one-on-one camera interview. He operates the camera himself, and just basically lays out the platform for why he's running for governor in 1991. He pays for it to be broadcast basically during the night. A lot of you probably see like public access things or like infomercials that are aired during the night. It was very similar for this on a news station in Lexington. It just so happened that Willie Nelson was driving through Kentucky on a concert tour that he was doing in his famous bus that he's known for, and was flipping channels and settled on this and listened to almost this entire campaign platform that Gatewood was giving, basically in the dark of night that probably no one else was watching. The next day, Willie Nelson tried to call Gatewood's office. Gatewood had not paid his phone bill. And it was answered. It was answered by somebody else in the building, the operator switch in the building, and they left a note for Gatewood basically on his door. Willie Nelson is trying to get in touch with you, right? So he ends up making this connection with Willie Nelson. Willie Nelson flies him to Texas. They play golf together. They become friends, and eventually Willie Nelson agrees to play a campaign fundraiser for Gatewood, not only for the 1991 campaign, but also 1995, 1999, and these different campaigns that he carried out. So it really gave fresh energy to Gatewood, because it got him kind of back in the newspapers and back in the public scene. Now, Gatewood did not win the primary in 1991, but it really helped to kind of make this name for himself, that he was starting to get this national attention. And not only was Willie Nelson interested in investing in Gatewood for his ideas about cannabis and different things like that, but also going back to this idea of trying to support and look out for Kentucky farmers. Obviously, we've seen Willie Nelson involved with Farm Aid concerts and these different things across the country, these different charities he's involved with, and so this really created this cohesive bond. And from 1991 up until Gatewood died in 2012, he and Willie Nelson were very, very close friends, spent time together every single year, and again, played for free for Gatewood many times to kind of support these different campaigns. So Gatewood, as he was campaigning, just trying to make these, trying to make these headlines. This is kind of where he lays out, again, his campaign that he was known for every other election that he ran in, right? So just some quotes from him. "I'm the most conservative candidate in this race. When I grew up, conservative meant you kept the government in a little box. When you opened up that box and let the government grow exponentially, it got out of control and got too intrusive." Again, these things that Gatewood was known for over and over and over again, how he kind of made his reputation as this like model libertarian, the way that we used to understand libertarianism. And I'm not espousing any political view, but I'm just saying this is kind of how he framed himself on the campaign trail. Again, he said, "There's no doubt that I'm an old hippie and I don't apologize to anybody for that. Certainly those are the same people who came together to stop the slaughter in Vietnam, and I'm proud of that. Compared to Republican, I'll take hippie every time." So again, not ever afraid to kind of let people know what he thought about their own ideas, about their own views. And so Gatewood, as he is laying this out, said, "It is our view that government has gotten too big and too intrusive, and we think that government ought to keep their hands off your bedroom, your bloodstream, your back pocket, your brain, your bladder, and your bingo hall." So again, known for these clips, known for these one-liners. He was especially known for this line that he would say at pretty much every public speaking engagement, every campaign forum, every event, in which, speaking to his daughter Molly and his daughter Abby, he would have them actually say at night before they went to bed. So these were the people that he was basically pledging to fight against in these campaigns: the petrochemical, pharmaceutical, military, industrial, transnational, corporate, fascist, elite SOBs. So he didn't use the abbreviation that I just did, right? So you can imagine having a 7-year-old and 9-year-old daughter and having them say that before they got in bed, right? So he again continued to run in these different campaigns. He ran for governor 5 different times, again for agriculture commissioner. He ran for Congress twice. He ran for attorney general once. So again, just really became synonymous. Again, if those of you who knew Gatewood or recognized his name or saw him, really became synonymous with Kentucky politics, right? Never in a heavy-handed or too much of a serious way, because he did not often have a chance in a lot of these races he ran in, but he was this real kind of breath of fresh air, not only to bring a little bit of levity with the comedy and with his one-liners that he did kind of master over time, but also with bringing in these ideas that really basic everyday people could communicate with, that could connect with. This was Gatewood's skill as a politician, was that he was able to make these one-on-one connections with a lot of voters and speak with them in ways that they understood, that they could connect with. As we saw throughout the 80s and 90s and 2000s, as we continue to see today, how much special interest and how much money has influenced politics. It's not often that you have much of a connection to a personal connection to a lot of the politicians that run today, and Gatewood did really provide that for a lot of people. So he had this very dedicated following. Was it a very wide following? Unfortunately, not wide enough for him to win any of these races, but he did really create and craft this trust with the people of Kentucky, right? No one ever along the way doubted that Gatewood was trying to cut a deal on them to benefit himself, right? He could have moderated his views. He could have started with local elections. He could have raised money. He could have been quiet about things that weren't popular. He could have depended on this connection that he had with the media to make money for himself and things like that, especially when he oftentimes really, really needed money. And he didn't do that, right? So, at the end of the day, we think about, political biographies. We think about these different studies of what we consider political elites today. And I read them. I'm deeply interested in them, in Kentucky politics and U.S. politics. But honestly, the reason I wanted to tell this story is because I don't think we see kind of this dimension, right? When I contacted Senator McConnell's office just to try and get, a brief interview or a quote of what he thought about Gatewood, I got as far as his press secretary, and basically what she communicated to me was that the winners make the decisions, right? And in one case, like, that's fair, that's fair for them to say that, but you can't deny that people like this had an impact. And I think a lot of times the human side of this is what gets lost in a lot of the political coverage and a lot of what we see today. So that was a big motivation for writing this book, was that, we see these people in public, we see these very sanitized, biographies. We see, even I work in the world of archives, we see a lot of cases where senators or congressmen or politicians or judges basically have to give special permission to people for them to be able to go in and see their records and learn more about them. That's not democratic to me, right? We need to be able to dig in and have a better view of who these people were as humans. And when you had a redeeming human like Gatewood was, that's why I felt it was a really compelling story to tell. So again, he did continue to run, but there was this, as I did these interviews, what I saw was this very different side of Gatewood, right? On the one hand, you get this very explosive, charismatic public figure that was oftentimes framed as like, you know, almost as like a buffoon or something like that, right? Because he couldn't handle money, because he was in the newspapers for not paying child support, because he was losing election after election after election. But you get, and you drill down to even his political adversaries or his family or his friends, you get at who Gatewood was as a person, right? And I think this story illustrates this pretty well. So during all of these campaigns, he was practicing law in Lexington, right? And I don't want to take too much of your time. Was practicing law in Lexington, right? So not only was he a skilled attorney, right? Was extremely good at connecting with juries, was extremely good about public speaking and having these relationships with his clients where he could build this trust. He often did pro bono work over and over and over and over again, especially for people who had misdemeanor or lower level felony counts of possession of marijuana, okay? Because of this kind of connection that he had to this issue. So these were some of the poorest people in Fayette County, throughout Kentucky, and he was dedicating his time when he was literally filing for bankruptcy or when he was running out of money to represent them for free because he so believed in this. So one of these stories came about when I was interviewing Gatewood's older brother, Hank, and Hank has since passed away before this book was published. But when I spoke with Hank, he talked about this time, this woman who was a student at the University of Kentucky had basically driven over to a friend's apartment complex, had parked her car, had gone in to study it, came out and saw that her car was towed. Right, that she didn't see a lot of signage, didn't see a lot of information, but her car was towed. If any of you have been to Lexington or spent time around UK, this is a very common scenario, right? So, you know, was really distraught, didn't have a lot of money, was just a sophomore at the University of Kentucky. She basically walked downtown because she went back to the site, took photos, and saw that there was nothing posted about there being, you know, parking restrictions for that apartment complex. She just happened to walk into Gatewood's office. She sat down, she bawled her eyes out, she kind of opened her soul to Gatewood and talked about this. And, you know, Gatewood took her information and said, you know, call back in a few days, I'm gonna see what I can do. He promised to kind of pursue this for her. So a week or so later, Gatewood gave her a call and told her to come into his office when she had a moment. She did, and there waiting for her after she had already gotten her car out was a check about 3 times bigger than she imagined seeing, right? Not only for the impoundment for the car, but also everything that she had gone through. And she asked basically, you know, what do I pay you? How much do I owe you? And Gatewood replied, this is a quote from Hank, "Honey, you don't owe me anything. I was glad to help you. I have 3 daughters in college and know that they or you don't have much money, so my services are free of charge." Right? So this was one small story, but you saw this over and over and over again. Again, this was a fairly small instance of, you know, a UK student doing this, this happening for a UK student in this case, but, you know, you had Gatewood driving to Bowling Green oftentimes to represent clients pro bono when they had been arrested for, you know, for marijuana possession and things like that. When, again, he didn't have any money, he definitely didn't have the time to be doing this. So, I just thought that story spoke so well, you know, to who Gatewood was and kind of what he was dedicated to. So he continued to run over and over again. The last election he ran in was for the Kentucky governor's race in 2011. So was really seen as this kind of Lexington and Kentucky folk hero. He sadly passed away in January of 2012 due to complications related to pneumonia and emphysema that he suffered with throughout his life related to the asthma. I have had, and this was one of the best parts about this book, was this very close relationship. I've gotten to know very well both Gatewood's ex-wife, Susan Sears, like I mentioned, his daughters, his siblings. And that was really important to me when I set out to write this book, that it wasn't just gonna be like this, again, this sanitized version that I was just getting from newspapers or something like that. But I also wanted them to be really clear, like, you know, if somebody was writing a biography about my dad, I'd probably want them to talk to me and be really clear about that, right? So it was really important for me to kind of build that trust with his family. And so, which resulted in them kind of sharing a lot of dimensions of Gatewood that people did not usually see. So This was when I was speaking with his ex-wife, Susan. So following Gatewood's death, when Susan and others were clearing out his possessions, she came upon a printed quote that he had left in a dresser drawer. Penned by George Bernard Shaw, it read, "I want to be thoroughly used up when I die, for the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle to me. It is sort of a splendid torch which I have got hold of for the moment. I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations." So this just illustrated so well what Gatewood believed in and what he did. He lived a hard and fast life, right? But in doing so, he fought for these ideals that he never gave up on, that he never compromised, that he really never regretted throughout his life either. So not only in this political spectrum, but the side of being able to talk to and get to know his family. The most important thing to take away from this was the deep abiding love that he, his siblings, this large family, his daughters had for one another, which really kept Gatewood going and alive for as long as it did. So, and I read this in the book, but basically when we talk about Gatewood, when we think about Gatewood, when you bring this name up, almost every person I have met doing events like this have some kind of story about Gatewood, whether they met him or whether they read a news story about him, whether they saw him on the news, or whether they saw him at a campaign event. And a lot of people understand him in these like singular dimensions, right? So hopefully this kind of sheds a better light about who Gatewood was as a person, who he was as a human. And so I wrote, remember Gatewood as all these things: an attorney, a politician, a candidate, an activist, a folk hero, a brother, a son, a father and grandfather, a champion for the persecuted, the downtrodden, and the common man. More than that, remember Gatewood is complicated, flawed, and an admirable human being. He used his life to fight for what he believed in with unflinching determination. He was a tireless worker, a crusader, a warrior for his beliefs, for freedom, dignity, justice, and compassion. This is the legacy of Lewis Gatewood Galbraith. Not the perennial candidate, not the marijuana candidate. He was the Kentucky candidate. So a lot of this goes back to the fact that he was reflecting a lot of what Kentuckians, as we know ourselves, if I can be an adopted Kentuckian now, right? It's been 10 years, so I'm considering myself one. But also just kind of like, we're known for this unflinching kind of kindness and compassion for other people. We're known for being passionate and for sometimes being loud and being upfront about what we believed in. Gatewood represented so much of this so much better than a lot of other politicians do, right? So that's what I was trying to get at with a lot of this book, was kind of speaking to this. Not only who he was as a person, but Gatewood's legacy in Kentucky politics today. Again, I spoke for this book. I interviewed and spoke at length with Paul Patton, with Ernie Fletcher, with Ben Chandler, with Scotty Basler, with these different people who again ran against him and who have kind of formed the landscape of Kentucky politics for a long time. And it is unflinchingly depressing and sad that Gatewood's time has finally come and he's not here to be recognized for everything that he fought for and that he believed in. He was starting in 1975, writing about a system that has basically come to pass, now in 2024 and 2025, right? So this idea of cannabis reform, he was a tireless advocate. There's this idea that we get into when we're talking about political ideas called the Overton window. A lot of you are probably familiar with this. Basically, the frame of what you can feasibly run political campaigns on, that you can raise money on, that you can expect to maybe be elected for, right? So, 30 years ago, gay marriage was outside of the Overton window. So we've seen this shift. Obviously, we have seen that shift with recreational cannabis in the past 20 years or so. It's just so striking to me that, again, Gatewood's writing about this in the 1970s, that 10 years ago, you couldn't have politicians running on this in Kentucky, and now we have the governor and legislature basically arguing about who gets credit for it, right? So, it's extremely striking that this happens so quickly, as we saw it unfolding throughout the country, really starting in 1996 in California and spreading throughout the country as well. I think we're to the point now 43 states have access to medicinal marijuana in some form, which is just an absolute seismic shift that not a lot of people saw coming. So not only that, right, but especially thinking about, and I spoke with, for example, Representative Nima Kulkarni, with Jason Neems, different people who are involved in the Kentucky State House today, and how important expungement is when we're thinking about the future of kind of cannabis legislation in Kentucky. There was a recent report that came out just this past October, where over 300,000 Kentuckians in the past 20 years have been arrested for marijuana possession in some form. Now, it's striking to think about, right? That's roughly, maybe a little bit smaller, but roughly the population of Lexington, where I live. Just thinking about that in 20 years, not only that, yes, a lot of these were probably fairly minor misdemeanor arrests, but how much that kind of echoes and amplifies as you're thinking about applying for jobs, as you're thinking about keeping families together, as you're thinking about financial struggles, as you're thinking about basically the ways in which this preys on the most vulnerable parts of our citizens here in Kentucky. 300,000 people in the past 20 years, right? That if you lived in another state, just a few hundred miles away, you wouldn't have this kind of like outsized impact. The same way, there was a study done by the Kentucky ACLU in 2019. Kentucky is the second worst state in the country for disproportionately prosecuting and arresting people of color for marijuana possession. The only state that was worse than us was Montana, right? And I think we have seen the impact of this. We have just celebrated, have just recognized a very somber anniversary of this happening with the death of Breonna Taylor just this past week, the 4-year anniversary of that happening right here in Louisville, right? So we continue to see so many of these implications. What would actually help people? What would actually assist these citizens? What would actually make a meaningful difference as we kind of square up with the fact that this war on drugs has failed that we've pursued over the past 30 years? You have to be able to go back and figure out how to heal some of these wounds, right? So the point of bringing this up and the point of pointing this out for Gatewood's legacy in Kentucky is, again, he was pointing this out. He was saying this on the public stage, in 1983 and 1982 as he was starting to run for office, right? So again, it's exceedingly sad to me, not only that Gatewood isn't here to kind of be recognized for the work that he did, but also just to see how many lives have been lost, how many families have been broken apart, how many lives have been shattered by these overly restrictive and overly punitive laws that we do have in Kentucky, especially related to something that you can walk down the street in New York City or Chicago and purchase at a shop and smoke on the street, right? It's interesting to think about this. Again, I'm 34 years old. Obviously I have 2 small children. I am not a cannabis user, right? Obviously, as it's still against the law here in Kentucky. But we think about the effects of the opioid epidemic, especially in Kentucky, and how much it has impacted our state and this region of the United States. Medical marijuana is not some kind of like magic bullet. I'm not here to tell you that it's going to like solve all these different problems that we do have. It's going to make money, yes. It's going to help people, yes. But there have been multiple peer-reviewed studies, scientific studies done, where communities that have access to medical marijuana, opioid overdoses go down usually between 15 and 20%. Okay, so that doesn't sound too striking or too crazy to think about as an alternative, but when we're thinking about this off-ramp, when we're looking at the history of Kentucky, especially over the past 20 years, that's saving thousands and thousands and thousands of lives, right? So these really small changes that, again, that maybe have gotten written off or laughed at in the past, I just don't really find funny in any way, right? When we're thinking about that, it really results in not only ruining people's lives, but oftentimes even taking people's lives simply because of these outdated ideas that we do not think about going back and reevaluating. Not only that, Gatewood was pointing out the spread of opioids in that campaign in 1990, 1991, before anyone was talking about this as well, too, right? So, again, Gatewood has been written off over and over and over again for a lot of these reasons, that he was seen as, louder than life, that he was seen as somebody who couldn't win an election, this idea of a perennial candidate that we see over and over and over again. But it's really that his ideas were way ahead of where the electorate was, of where politics were as he was alive. So that's what I'm hoping a lot of people take from this book, is that we still need to identify and recognize people who have done this work in the past as we start to make progress on a lot of these issues today here in Kentucky and throughout the country. And it's just so important for me to be able to point that out, and hopefully at least to describe a few people. Again, my day-to-day job is working with young people at the University of Kentucky, working with undergraduates who, it's scary for me to tell you this, but the freshmen that I work with today were born in 2006. right? 2005, 2006. So a lot of people who, don't know Gatewood, aren't familiar with him or anything like that. So it's a privilege to be able to share some of this with them as well, to be able to point to things that are maybe popular today, like this is how this progress has been made. I think, I don't know if we can all agree on this, but I think whether it's in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 25 years, we will eventually have recreational cannabis in Kentucky. We will probably have it throughout the country as we continue to see, especially how much tax money this is raising to support things like public education, public health, which is desperately needed here in Kentucky especially. But I'm here to plant a flag to say that when we do pass recreational cannabis law here in Kentucky, that it needs to be called the Gatewood-Galbraith Act. So that's the thing that I've been trying to finish these speaking engagements with, that we need to identify, we need to recognize people who have gotten us to where we are today. The point of a biography is not to whitewash everything and act like everyone was perfect in every way, which Gatewood certainly was not, but it would be a lot more boring of a story to write, right? So he was this person who was pushing through adversity, pushing through his own personal challenges, fighting for what he believed in, and that's what I kind of hope comes off the page of everyone. So I appreciate you letting me share some of that with you, or preaching. I feel very much like a preacher up here, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you all have or to cover anything else that I haven't discussed yet. And thank you for coming. I really do appreciate it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If Gatewood was running today, maybe not at governor, but say ag secretary, what do you think his chances would be?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Do you think we've evolved up to his ideas?
And this is something that I've been asked a lot, as I've done these different interviews for the book and things like that. Obviously, I think it would be a lot easier today for people to, and I think we see it, to raise money, for these ideas that he couldn't have, when he was running in 1983 or anything like that. It's interesting to think about. So yes, I think he would be more successful.
Especially
now,
with the cult of personality.
Exactly, and if he was able to, keep that up and kind of grow that over time, I would definitely see. The other thing is though, Gatewood was never one to fall in line, especially later in these later elections. He was often running third party and said equally, spicy and bad things about Democrats and Republicans. So it was almost like he had kind of removed himself from the system, which today there is not room for third parties basically anywhere in any form of United States politics. So in that way, it would be hard, but I would think it would be a lot easier based on these beliefs to raise money and to be successful in these different elections. I oftentimes I get that question. I have questions pretty often about how he would relate to, as we think about him as a libertarian compared to maybe who's framed as a libertarian today, maybe even here in Kentucky, like Senator Rand Paul, these different people, or we think about kind of the conservative movement over the past, 8 to 10 years, how he would respond to that. It's anybody's guess. Gatewood was absolutely against the establishment in pretty much any way that he possibly could be, but he was also had a great nose for picking out when people were being honest or if people were just trying to take advantage of other people, which is probably the best way for me to answer that. But to answer your question in a succinct way, I think he would be a lot more successful if he was able to figure out a lot of these other issues that plagued a lot of his campaigns over time, just based on his plank and his platform. Yeah.
I'm curious as to whether Mr. Galbraith, during his life, had influence on or was influenced by other notable public figures. Hunter S. Thompson comes to mind as an initial example.
Yeah.
You mentioned Willie Nelson, you mentioned, Kentucky politicians, but other than those folks, who else did Gatewood Galbraith interact with?
Yeah, these basically these ideas outside of politics, these cultural ideas. And Gatewood was, again, not only in Kentucky, but seen throughout the country as this leader in basically progressive marijuana laws and legislation. So he actually helped draft the medicinal cannabis law in Oregon. He spoke in Washington, D.C. quite often, spoke in Michigan, these different places as they were trying to get behind this. he was, through Willie Nelson, connected with a lot of these different, these kind of like countercultural icons. It was not often that it would be like the level of like Hunter S. Thompson, but it would be basically people who are involved in the movement. So people who were involved with the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, so NORML, and these different organizations that he would oftentimes like interact with and speak with. So I don't think there's a lot of record of him like interacting with maybe these like the way that we think of these like countercultural celebrities today, outside of people that he would speak along with at different conferences or interact with in that way. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Somewhat.
All right. Anything else? Well, thank you for a great topic, about an interesting book about an uncommon man.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. And I was going to say too, I'm sorry that I don't have any books with me today. I'll encourage you all, if you're interested in reading it. First of all, I've been telling all these, anyone who comes to an event, like at the least, encourage your public library to purchase a copy of it. I'm obviously not in this to make money in any way, but I do want people to be able to access the book when they can. So I'd really encourage you to do that. If you're interested in the book, there are signed copies at both locations of Carmichael's. So I'm all for supporting local bookstores, obviously. So if you do want to pick the book up there, there's some flyers on this table and then at the end of the food table that has a QR code. If you're interested in ordering the book, you can just scan that and they make it nice and easy. More than that, if you do read it, please send me an email and tell me what you think, because I'd love to speak with you all more about it or answer any of the questions that you do have. And thank you all again for having me. I mean, the services you all provide are so important, and I was just I was glad to be able to kind of discover this place on my own and be able to see this. So thank you so much for having me. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks.